Phoenix Holland Pal app.
So time now for our news review, where we take you through the Sunday papers. Here with me this morning, Aggie Chambray, political correspondent at LBC, and Sacha O'Sullivan, host of Westminster Insider at Politico Europe. So very good morning to both of you. Lovely to see you both. Lots of politics around on the front pages. The Sunday Telegraph is the one we're going to kick off with. Sacha, you've picked this out. This is Peter Navarro. He's described as his tariff czar, isn't he? He's the one who's pushed this big idea of tariffs, who's done an interview with the Sunday Telegraph.
Yeah, so Peter Navarro is a kind of very, very influential person in the Trump administration at the moment. He's behind a lot of the kind of big tariff stuff and the 145% tariffs on China. And he's done this interview and said basically that the UK is kind of being led by China, and he refers to the UK as having its blood sucked dry by Beijing. And the idea is something that we've talked about for years in the UK, actually, that infrastructure projects, critical bits of our systems, things, conversations that we had about Huawei, or more recently the Scunthorpe Steel. They are owned by China, and he says that's a risk to us. And his theory is that because China can no longer send so many of its goods to the US as a result of these tariffs, they're going to be looking to places like the UK and the EU and other Asian countries to kind of offload their goods, he says. And, the Telegraph says that this could put any trade deal between the UK and the US under threat. I don't think it really does. And Navarro says, even in the interview, we are moving in Trump time on the trade deal, which basically means they're doing it as fast as possible. But it is an interesting story because now that China and the US have reached tipping point in terms of tariffs. I mean, they could keep going up from 145% to just forever and ever. But they actually have to look overseas about how to have some leverage on this relationship and isolate China in a more global sense.
Yeah, so you think that's part of it? It's part of them being able to stick to their guns by trying to get other countries on side with them. What do you make of this, Aggie? I mean, it is a delicate time for the government, who's trying to do deals, lots of trade deals around the world, not least with the EU as well. And there's a suggestion that some of the rules they might accept in a deal with the EU could run counter with what the US would want. And it's a difficult balancing act. And the relationship with China, again, a tricky one.
I think that's exactly right. I think it is really difficult. And interviews like this, the government will probably slightly have their heads in their hands because they are so keen to get that trade deal over the line with the US. But you have had people like Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, and the Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, going over to China for these quite high-profile visits to China in the last few months and saying that they want to have this pragmatic re-engagement with Beijing.
Which means they want some investment. They're desperate for growth in this country, and they think that China has some of the money to be able to put that investment in.
I think that's completely right, because growth is their number one mission. They say that over and over again. But they want growth. They want to have investment from China. They want a trade deal with the US, and they want to keep on side with Europeans and have closer ties with the EU there as well. And they are trying to do all of those various different things concurrently. And I think that is what is difficult at the moment. They still look like they are going to get a trade deal, hopefully with the US sooner rather than later, in Trump time, as Sacha called it. But it is difficult, and interviews like this, I suspect, won't help.
Is there any steer on when that might come? There were some suggestions that we were actually lower down the pecking order than we'd hoped in terms of speed. What's the word?
I think we always want to think that we're more important than we actually are. I think that the government at the moment is the US trade deal and a closer relationship with the EU are the kind of number two priorities, I should say, in terms of getting that growth in, because that's the easiest way to do it. And we still do have 10% tariffs, we still have that baseline level tariffs from the US, and that's going to be a massive concern.
Indeed. We'll watch for progress. Let's go to the front of the Sunday Times next, Aggie, because they have done an interview with Zia Youssef of Reform, who, in fact, Trevor Phillips will be talking to later. So it'll be very interesting to hear what he has to say about some of these points. And the headline is intriguing. Young need a moral re-education. That's obviously one of the things he said. Talk us through it.
That's right. So Zia Youssef, of course, is the chairman of Reform UK. And this is all in the wake of Reform being the real winners out of the local elections and mayoral and indeed the by-election on Thursday and Friday, those results coming in. And this is basically about Zia Youssef setting out what a reform government could potentially look like, what those first 100 days could look like. So talking about, remoralising young people, declaring a national emergency on illegal migration. So things like that. But fundamentally, this is Nigel Farage trying to be taken seriously as potential Prime Minister, which, after Thursday and Friday, people, Westminster watchers, are starting to think could happen. If you took those votes and you extrapolated it to a national share, he could genuinely be the next Prime Minister. So this is about reform, trying to sketch out what that might potentially look like. And for the other parties too, for the Conservatives, they haven't put forward that many policies yet. That's on purpose. Kemi Badenoch has talked about wanting to sort of do these policy workshops. I think they are slightly changing their tune on that. I think we should expect to see more policies soon. But I think Reform are slightly trying to make the most out of that policy vacuum. And then in terms of for the Labour government, I think there are some Labour sources I've spoken to who are quite pleased that Reform UK are going to have to sketch out exactly what they say they would do in government. They think that might be quite helpful to them. They think there'll be more scrutiny on what reform would actually do and what that might look like. And they are going to put more pressure on things like where Nigel Farage stands on funding of the NHS. He has said he doesn't want that, to Beth Rigby actually on Sky News, to come from general taxation. Labour want to make a really big thing of that because the NHS is obviously something that's very, very popular. But I think we are seeing, a seismic shift in what politics looks like. It was John Curtis, the polling supremo, who said on Friday morning, we're now in the era of five-party politics. And I think we will see more of this, indeed, at 8:30 on Sky News, hearing more about what a reform government actually might look like.
Well, that's right. And we get the impression that Nigel Farage is very conscious of the fact that he wants to say we should be taken seriously. We're not just the protest party, and the votes at the local elections have proved that. What do you think the pitfalls are of laying out the first 100 days of a reform government, what it would look like?
Gosh, there's a lot of pitfalls for Nigel Farage. When he was, the leader of UKIP and they were doing kind of policy manifestos, they would kind of rapidly fall apart in the space of maybe a couple of hours the moment you look at their costings.
But UKIP was nothing like as successful as Reform.
UKIP was nowhere near as successful as Reform, but I think that there is this sense of looking at how Nigel Farage is very good at delivering those emotional messages. Historically, when he has tried to lay out a more thoughtful policy platform that has unravelled, he does have a more sophisticated party mechanism behind him. The interesting thing that I think actually is, him saying we're not just a protest vote, we're not just a protest party. There are a lot of people who vote for Reform because they're kind of anti-institutional. And so I'm kind of fascinated to see what happens once they do start to institutionalise themselves a bit more. And they do have to kind of behave a bit more like the political parties that we know. Do people just suddenly start to look at them and go, OK, well, you're just like the rest of them?
I think, though, what happened last July was there was a lot of protest votes actually for Labour. Lots and lots of people didn't want to vote for the Conservatives anymore and basically wanted to give the other guys a go to see if they could make the country any better. And I think that is what happened. And what we saw on Thursday was a different type of protest vote. I don't think it necessarily means people are voting for a protest party, but rather they're protesting against what the current state of affairs is. And I think Labour are going to have to change things very quickly. I think they know that and kind of get back on track, so to speak, and that's what Labour MPs say to me, so that they don't have another set of protest votes the next time people go to the ballot box.
And I guess Nigel Farage would say Donald Trump set himself up as anti-establishment, and he's done very well.
That is very true.
Let's move on to the Mail on Sunday, though, because obviously the big losers in the local elections were Labour, but perhaps more significantly the Tories. And the question is what those parties do next. And according to the Mail on Sunday, Kemi Badenoch is keen to say that she won't be chasing the Farage ride.
I think that's right. So on the front page of the Sunday Telegraph, you have Kemi Badenoch basically saying, the Sunday Telegraph has spoken to Conservative strategists who have decided their policy is not going to be chasing Reform UK to the right on policy. I just mentioned there, they haven't put forward a huge amount of policy yet. The Telegraph says that is going to change. They're going to put forward more policy, like, for example, looking at a withdrawal of the European Convention on Human Rights. They say after Thursday, it sort of kicked a lot of people into action. They've got £500,000 more in donations. But fundamentally, this is a decision I think every party is having to make at the moment. Where are the votes that they are missing coming from? So, for example, as Emma just mentioned, where are the Labour government going to go to next? But also, where are the Tories going to go? So they could go to the left. They could become this kind of reform-light character party. They say they're not going to do that. But you saw it play out in the last general election too. Do you remember on national service, Rishi Sunak saying that he wanted there to be national service for everybody, for all young people? And I was speaking to someone very close to him after that, and they basically said, well, that's because Nigel Farage wasn't in the race at that stage. He wasn't going to run to be an MP. He wasn't leader of Reform UK. So we thought, OK, there's an opportunity for us here. We can do this national service thing. Then when Nigel Farage came back into the race, they thought, OK, well, maybe we should, actually go for the Lib Dem vote rather than that. And I think that's kind of what you can see here. If Kemi Badenoch goes tax to the right, and they become Reform Light, well, wouldn't people just vote for Reform UK? But I think we're going to see exactly where people want to go in the next few months, and it's going to be really interesting, especially seeing on that policy platform. But I think, as Sasha said when we were talking about the manifesto too, the IFS did say when Reform UK put forward they called it a contract, but their manifesto in the last general election, the IFS did basically say this doesn't add up. So Reform are going to have to make sure their policies, their numbers do add up to try and make something of this. There was concern as well in the Sunday Times just on this that they might get some defections to Reform from the Conservatives, like Suella Braverman. And she's actually written for LBC in the last couple of days, and she talked about, we need less woke education and we need more on immigration. And actually, the things she was saying were quite similar to the Reform policy. So that is definitely one to watch.
One to watch, interesting. And thanks for getting me back on track. Sunday Telegraph, not the Mail on Sunday. I got ahead of myself there. What do you make of how the party should respond? Because there are questions for Labour as well.
Yeah, and it's really difficult, actually, because in some respects, there are some Labour MPs who see Reform as outflanking them on the left, and they really struggled with that over the steelworks, for example, and the idea of nationalisation. For the Conservatives, it is this kind of, Kemi's comfortable place is culture wars. That's where, a couple of weeks ago when there was the judgment on the Supreme Court on the Equality Act and trans people, that was where she felt most comfortable. It is also where Nigel Farage feels most comfortable. So I think it would be very interesting to see the kinds of policies which come out. Because again, if she starts talking about net zero or things like that, that is where Nigel Farage has already kind of laid himself a runway to make himself the spokesperson for these issues. And trying to find that kind of middle ground. I mean, we used to have like the One Nation Tories in the good old days, and that's not really a faction of the Conservative Party that we see so much or hear so much from. I'm not entirely sure that there is a hell of a lot of wiggle room for Kemi Badenoch to find that space to say these are uniquely Conservative values.
Will she survive, very briefly?
For the moment, yes. I'm not sure until the next general election.
Agreed?
I agree.
Interesting stuff. Lots more to discuss in the next hour. We've scratched the surface of the Sunday paper, so join us again in an hour. For the moment, thanks very much indeed.
Jubilation in the streets, while some